Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
Did your grandma have a Christmas cactus when you were growing up?
You know what? My grandmother did not, but it sounds like something I can picture a lot of grandmothers doing.
Oh, okay. Well, my grandmother had a Christmas cactus when I was growing up, and I always thought it was the coolest thing, and I wondered where it came from when I was a kid. And it wasn't until I got older and I realized, wow, that cactus that my grandma had, it didn't grow out in the middle of the desert like you typically think of cactus growing. It grew in the rainforest.
The Climatron at the Missouri Botanical Garden has more than 2,800 different types of plants within it, some of them quite unusual. I'm Sarah Fensky. This is St. Louis on the Air. Yesterday was a big milestone for a St. Louis institution. The Climatron at the Missouri Botanical Garden turned 60. And while we might take this geodesic dome for granted, we really shouldn't. It's not just a great place to see tropical foliage in the St. Louis winter. In 1976, the Climatron was named one of the 100 most significant architectural achievements in United States history. That's definitely something to celebrate. And so joining us today to discuss the Climatron's history and its birthday is Susie Ratliff. She's a horticulturalist at the Botanical Garden. She actually works right there in the Climatron. So, Susie, welcome.
Hi, how are you today?
So I'm excited to talk about this. I think this Climatron is one of my favorite places to visit around town. Take us back to 1960. What made the Climatron such a big deal?
The Climatron was actually the first geodesic dome ever built. Our Buckminster Fuller had this plan, and it all came together, and it was quite an undertaking and quite an accomplishment.
What led to the first geodesic dome? I now realize that's how one says it. What led to that being built here in St. Louis?
The garden was looking for ways to encourage people to come, to increase visitorship, to give a one-of-a-kind experience, to grow and at the same time provide a service and help with education and just all kinds of little things.
So this was meant in many ways to be an attraction, almost like a tourist attraction, to bring people into the Botanical Garden.
Yes, in a lot of ways, but it was also from the start, it was also meant to be a place where you could study. You could study plants, you could study architecture, obviously, ecosystems, climate control systems.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you find a lot of people coming there today to study the plants that are there. There's such a remarkable variety that are there. Do you still find people who come in who are interested in the architecture?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And what's really cool is occasionally we will get a visitor that comes in and they were part of the renovation in the 80s, okay? In the late 80s, the Climatron went through a renovation. And, yeah, some of the folks that, worked on that renovation, they come in and they look around and wow, things have really grown, and they talk about how certain things have aged and how well they look, and yeah, it's really cool.
So there's more than 2,800 plants in there. Give us some of the highlights.
Oh, well, for me, it's epiphytes, but I mean, we have the Ravenella madagascariensis. It's called the traveler's palm. We have a banyan, we have epiphytic cactus, we have orchids. I mean, we just have a little bit of everything. And we are adding new plants all the time. We recently redid one of the beds where the focus is on plants that are endemic to the Mauritius, Madagascar area, because so many of those plants are in danger of, from climate change, from various different things. And yeah, we have a lot of wild collected plants in the Climatron.
And I understand some of them. So you have some wild plants that are harvested in other places. But I understand some of these plants date back to the 1920s, and even some of them go all the way back to the 1904 World's Fair. Can that be right?
Yes, it is. We have cycads in what we refer to as cycad ridge. It's kind of a central bed in the Climatron, and there are plants in there that were donated to the garden from the 1904 World's Fair. I believe they were from the Mexican government, and even though we've had them since 1904, which is quite a long time, the plants are probably actually much older than that. They grow very slow, and these plants could easily be 200 or 300 years old or more.
Wow, that's so cool. That gives us a sense of our own just blip in this timing here. I'm also curious, you mentioned that for you, a big highlight is the epiphytes. And this is my ignorance of botany. But what is an epiphyte?
Okay, an epiphyte is any plant that uses another plant to get in a position to get the light and moisture and what it needs to grow. Orchids are epiphytes. You will frequently find them growing on a tree. They're climbing up the tree and they're rooting on the tree. They don't hurt the plant that they're on. Mm-hmm. They just use it to get in a position where they can get what they need.
That's pretty cool. So they're able to use this plant. They're not harming it. This is not a parasite situation.
No.
But they're climbing up towards the light or getting the nutrients.
Yes.
And so orchids are an example of that. What's another example of an epiphyte?
Epiphytic cactus. Okay. Did your grandma have a Christmas cactus when you were growing up?
You know what? My grandmother did not, but it sounds like something I can picture a lot of grandmothers doing.
Oh, okay. Well, my grandmother had a Christmas cactus when I was growing up, and I always thought it was the coolest thing, and I wondered where it came from when I was a kid. And it wasn't until I got older and I realized, wow, that cactus that my grandma had, it didn't grow out in the middle of the desert like you typically think of cactus growing. Mm-hmm. It grew in the rainforest on a tree branch, or a rock face, trying to get light. It grew in the rainforest.
So these are plants that have found ways to thrive in situations where you wouldn't assume they could thrive.
Exactly.
That is interesting. I can see why you have such appreciation for them. You talking about the orchids, that brings to mind something else I wanted to ask you about. And as somebody who did not grow up in St. Louis, this was news to me, but I understand there's a lot of kids who went through the Climatron for class trips who are going to know what we're talking about here. And that is that there was a talking orchid within the Climatron. Yes. Is that right? What was the idea behind that?
It was a way to connect with children and teach them somewhat about epiphytes. You would walk up to this, and this voice would say, "Hello, would you give me a drink?" And it would tell you how to go about giving it a drink. There was a little fountain there with water in it. You kept it in your hand. You put it up to the tube.
Susie? Oh, I think we might have lost...
It would proceed to tell you different things about orchids.
Okay, so Susie, your phone just blipped out there for a second, but I can hear you back with us now, and you sound great. And so you're saying this orchid would share with the children information about orchids after drinking water out of your hand? Is that right?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
That sounds like some elaborate engineering there. How is this a one-of-a-kind orchid? I mean, how did this come to be?
It was all part of the renovation, and I'm not really sure how it came to be or whose idea it was, but I know that a lot of people really enjoyed it. A lot of kids really enjoyed it, and we still have people that come in and question, where did it go? What happened to it? And it eventually just wore out.
So people are still asking about this thing. Are there any plans to maybe bring it back?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, the last that I heard was that would be a donor project. If there was somebody that was, willing to donate the money to do it, that they would consider it, they would talk about it. That was the last I heard several years ago.
Okay, so if someone wanted to take this on, there might be interest in doing it, but it would really require someone having a special intention towards the talking orchid.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Susie, bigger question I've got to ask you. You've worked at the Climatron since 1997. Did it take some adjustment to get used to working within all that humidity?
No, I'm one of those people that the humidity doesn't bother me. The heat and humidity doesn't bother me quite as much as it does a lot of people. But folks don't understand. We have a cooling system in here during the summer, and it is frequently cooler in the Climatron than it is outside.
So what's the range of temperature that the Climatron is staying within?
Our average is 64 degrees for the low and 85 for the high, and about 85% humidity. That's kind of like a yearly average.
Okay. I mean, actually, that sounds kind of wonderful. Are your friends super jealous that as the winter, goes on and the snow is falling, you're inside the Climatron getting to garden in this balmy weather?
I get a lot of friends that do come and see me during the winter.
I bet that makes you quite popular. So you've been there now for all this time. I'm wondering how this Climatron is holding up. You said it had this big project that took place to renovate it, bring it up to speed. Is it in pretty good shape today?
We have some leakage, but it's a building. Any building is going to have issues, but no, we have a great team in our maintenance department that keeps things going. But eventually it may need another renovation, but for the time being, we're doing pretty well.
Well, that's great. And I hope people hearing this conversation today are inspired to go out and give it another visit. I understand you guys are now open again. You closed during the earlier part of the pandemic. Was that hard, having it closed to the public after so many years of getting used to that interaction?
It was hard for all of us. The garden itself was closed for a little bit, and then even after the garden opened, it took us a little bit to catch up to where we were visitor worthy. The folks that did the watering and stuff while we were off, there was a core staff that did the watering and kept the plants alive. They did a fantastic job, but there was no weeding and there was no pruning, and we really walked into a jungle.
Wow! So you had to do some work to get it ready for visitors again.
Yes.
And today, if we came to visit, would it look a little wilder than it did pre-pandemic?
Yeah, still a little bit. We're still trying to catch up. They're plants, plants that we pruned a month ago are starting to put on new growth and grow on. So, it's a constant thing. We're always pruning and weeding in here.
Well, last question for people who are maybe thinking about planning a return visit to the Climatron to help celebrate this 60th birthday. Is there something within the Climatron that visitors might not know about or tend to overlook that you'd want to point people towards today?
My biggest, when you walk into the Climatron, or actually when you go anywhere in nature, take a few steps, stop, look around, look up, look down. Look for those little insignificant-looking flowers, because some of them are just absolutely fascinating. Don't just rush through. Take your time and actually look around. besides the plants, you might see the birds. You might see a gecko. We have geckos that live in the Climatron. Take your time and just really look at things, because when you do that, then you'll start seeing these little epiphytes and little plants growing on a rock face that you think, how did that get there?
So take a moment and really experience everything that you're walking into.
Yes.
Well, that's some great advice. And Susie Ratliff, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you.
And happy birthday to the Climatron.
Oh, yes.
If you learned something new from today's episode, consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the easiest way to help people discover our show. We appreciate it. Thank you. Podcast episodes of St. Louis on the Air are available at stlpublicradio.org, or you can subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts, the Stitcher podcast app, or wherever you get your podcasts. St. Louis on the Air is produced by Evie Hemphill and Lara Hamden, with production assistance from Aaron Dorr. The senior producer is Emily Woodbury, and the executive producer is Alex Hoyer. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. That's 90.7 KWMU. Thank you for listening. I'm Sarah Fensky.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.